Welcome and thank you for joining LHH in today's webcast. My name is Helene Cavalli and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'd like to start by making some introductions. We're going to be presenting today on succeeding in the new virtual world of work, and joining us are Dr. Mary-Clare Race. Mary-Clare is the Chief Innovation and Product Officer at Lee Hecht Harrison, as well as Keith Ferrazzi. Keith is chairman of the Ferrazzi Greenlight and was formerly CMO of Deloitte and Starwood Hotels. His organization's mission is to transform teams to transform the world. Keith is a New York Times #1 best-selling author of Who's Got Your Back and Never Eat Alone. His new book, Leading Without Authority, reinvents collaboration in a remote working world, and it's now available, so you want to go get that. Ferrazzi Greenlight Research Institute conducted 2 years of research and published over 25 studies on the topics of remote workers, remote leaders, and remote teams. These resources are published on a resource site at www.virtualteamswin.com. We'll be sending a follow-up email to all attendees with a link to these resources, and I will add this website to the chat. Now, to get back to a few housekeeping items, and just to ensure that you have a really great experience, I want to let you know that as you join the meeting, your audio will be automatically connected to your computer, via your computer, and you'll be placed on mute. If you can't join by computer audio, there's some instructions that we have for you. You'll want to dial 669-900-6833. And you'll be asked to enter a webinar ID, and that ID is 700-790-270. You will be asked to enter a participant ID, but that's not mandatory. So if you don't have that, you can skip that. Now, a little bit about the interactive features. If you hover your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen, you'll see that you have a couple of icons to choose from. You have a chat function, and you'll want to use chat to send me any technical questions. Fawn on our team is going to send everyone a chat message to help you find that chat panel right now. And then we have a Q&A functionality. And throughout the session, we encourage you to use Q&A to enter your questions. And we'll address those during the presentation and as well at the end when we have some dedicated time to Q&A. So we'll get started now with Mary-Clare and Keith, and then we'll open it up for questions. But please note that this is a conversation and we won't be using any slides, but we will be sharing and posting the recording to lhh.com shortly after the presentation. So enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Helene, for those introductions, and welcome to everyone joining us on the webinar today. A huge thank you also to you, Keith, for taking the time out to have this conversation with me on this very important topic. We've had a huge amount of interest in the topic today, which I think speaks volumes about just how front of mind this subject is for everyone. So without further ado, let me get into, I guess, my first area of discussion with you. And I think what I'd love to start by focusing on, Keith, is one of the areas that you've spent a lot of time researching and understanding, and particularly in the area of team effectiveness. And I think I'm right in saying that you've found that in many situations, teams are failing to reach their full potential, and that this can often be even more pronounced when we have teams working in a virtual setting. So I guess my question would be, as we get to grips with this new virtual world of work that we now find ourselves in, what can we do to buck the trend and maybe even use this situation as an opportunity to hit reboot on the way our team is working?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, because what time is it there in Ireland today?
Yeah, it's just gone 11 p.m., but I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing, Keith.
Well, I'm not sure. I wonder if video can register disingenuousness, but that's okay. I really appreciate you being here. And it's nice to see you again. I think the last time we excuse me, physically saw each other. We were in New York City right before all of this crisis hit. So yes, let's all admit it. Most of our teams are a bit dysfunctional. It's sort of like our families. The reality is that we have found that over 70% of teams, for instance, will say that it is difficult for them to speak their minds openly among their teams. So we've all been in situation with teams where the real conversations happens after the meeting, you know. Also, interestingly enough, that most teams do not feel that they are deeply collaboratively engaged with their peers. If you were to ask a team the question, are you extracting value from the interdependencies of your team? Where well over 70% would say no. So the reality is that we have not been paying sufficient attention to the organism called the team. We go from strategy and then we dive into role success. And we're missing the real nurturing of the team. I mean, just anecdotally, we've all seen those sports shows where it's a movie and this ragtag bunch of sports people all of a sudden go from being argumentative and ragtag to being this high performing and they win the pennant. Well, that's the thing that I believe is absolutely possible in most organizations today. The challenge is in a remote environment, which we've now moved into, or at least a balanced environment, but very heavily remote and virtual environment. The likelihood is that the performance of the team is actually going to go down unless there's a great deal of attention and purposefulness put to it. We find that trust can go down upwards of 83% in the majority of teams that go remote. Trust goes up to 83% decrease in those teams. Performance can go down by 50%. I know it's the nightmare of a lot of leaders today who are worried of whether or not productivity is going to go down in a remote environment, particularly with all the challenges people have working out of their homes. And we find a lack of alignment. 50% of teams report a lack of alignment, clarity, and more confusion in a remote environment. Now, I am not going to say that that is innate to being a remote or virtual team. I'm going to say that what we have seen in our research is that when a team becomes purposeful in engaging each other and redefining and what I call recontracting the team, I want us to use this crisis and I want us to use the fact that we're virtual and remote now as an opportunity to show up and do a formal recontracting of the team. And when we do that, we see that teams actually go higher in terms of their performance than they did otherwise. On a scale of 0 to 5, unfortunately, most teams today are somewhere in the mid-2s in terms of their self-proclaimed analysis of whether they're effective and high-performing. And what we find is that teams that are purposeful and remote can move up into above the 4s.
Goodness, that is quite the shift. And what in particular is it about the virtual setting or the remote nature of these teams, Keith, that can lead things to go wrong? So what, are there common pitfalls or traps that teams fall into when we move to virtual working?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is we focus too much on the fact that now that we're virtual, we have physical distance. You and I have, a great deal of physical distance between Los Angeles and Ireland. But that's not the problem. As a leader or somebody in HR, we need to be focused on how do we help our leaders close the operational distance, which one might call alignment, where the team is not aligned around the North Star mission. They're not aligned around the priorities, the 10 hills we have to take, and they don't have a process by which they can, in an agile way, re-diagnose through a series of sprints what our priorities are and resort the deck of those priorities. So that's operational or strategic distance. We're not focusing enough time on that. And then the second piece is we're not focusing enough time on what's called affinity distance. Our greatest recognition in coaching teams over 20 years is that teams fail to see each other as their support structure. Teams fail to see each other as their accountability structure. Teams fail to see each other as their developmental coaches. Highest performing teams shift from being individuals performing earnestly in a team to individuals who will cross the finish line together. And that is a massive shift. And that massive shift is not what most teams have today. But frankly, we need that in this day and age, this crisis we have. We need to recontract, a formal recontracting, to shift this team's commitment on a number of dimensions to being a high-performing, what we call a co-elevating team. The two resources I would give you for that are the new book, Leading Without Authority, really defines what does it mean to be co-elevating in a team. So that's one resource that's available. But the other resource we're giving for free is we've developed a resource center, which Elena mentioned earlier, at virtualteamswin.com. It will take all of our Harvard Business Review articles, all of the podcasts, all new pieces we're creating, and we're putting them there as a resource for people.
Okay, great. And yeah, and I mean, I think the piece about affinity distance definitely resonates for me. Something I've noticed in the last couple of weeks. My team already works almost entirely virtually, but given the nature of this crisis and the fact that we're having to socially distance in our day-to-day lives, that in the work setting, that need for connection and human, that human piece has become even more important. So there's maybe something there for people to really think about how much attention they're paying to those different types of distance that you outlined. I think that's really helpful. Keith, I know you and the team have also identified some very practical techniques and 8 strategies that we're gonna share today. And again, folks who've maybe just joined in the last few minutes, we will be making these strategies available to you on the platform that Keith has shared with us, and we'll make sure you have the link to that. But Keith, maybe we can just dive right into that now and explore what are these 8 practical strategies that we can all put in place, and perhaps go into the detail of some of those.
Sure. So number one is a team needs to see each other as a vehicle for co-creation of solutions. So right now, this medium is used as broadcast, but it's, we are sitting here, one person's talking, you'll have a team meeting and it's the leader talking, asking questions, crickets, etc. And the team does not see each other as a co-creative force. So we need to shift to greater collaboration and collaborative problem solving in our team meetings. And how do we use the virtual format for that? Very important. Second is candor. We need to radically accelerate the candor among our teams. Traditional teams have very low candor and a lot of conflict avoidance. And we need to shift to a higher degree of risk-taking, challenging, the ability for people to speak their minds, speak the truth, a greater degree of transparency. That is massive in terms of outcomes and performance. The third is accountability. Now, traditional accountability, a lot of organizations have high, which is metrics and performance. What I'm talking about is accountability to each other, where the team members see each other and hold each other accountable. It is such an important area because right now, most accountability is only the leader and to the metrics. We need to be shifting to holding each other accountable. And again, in a remote environment, having the leader running around doing individual meetings and individual accountability, it's very, very difficult. We need to disperse that commitment to peer-to-peer accountability. The next one is commitment. And commitment really has to do with the relational affinity. This is the commitment of a team to each other. It's the care, it's the intimacy, it's the exercising of vulnerability, it's the loyalty. And accelerating that commitment is a very powerful element of shifting a team. Development. You and I have often heard the phrase back in the old days of a learning organization. What does it mean to be a constantly growing and learning organization? I don't think we've ever really gotten that right. One of the challenges is, we all know that, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal on this, managers don't have time to coach the way they used to. And our leaders that are listening to this don't have time to coach like they used to. We need to disperse coaching and development into the fabric of the team. So just like accountability needed to shift into the fabric of the team to peer-to-peer, so does development need to shift into the fabric of the team peer-to-peer. The next piece is the definition of a team. Defining a team as not just those who report to you, but defining a team most broadly as those who need to get the job done, whether it's a gig worker, whether it's a member of a group that doesn't report to you, but you have to collaborate with. It could even be somebody you're pissed off about, and that they've been making it difficult for this team to achieve its mission. That individual, darn it, is a member of our team. We work in networks today. I wrote a formative book on networking called Never Eat Alone. Today we wake up and leading and work is done in networks. We need to think of our teams as a constantly fluid design where you have goals aligned to networks, and those networks are your teams. So rethinking the definition of team. The next piece is energy. How do you dial up energy? I think there's a lot of momentum right now based on the crisis. And I think we're starting to feel the energy drain of a week and a half of solitude. And people are starting to lose that energy. And I think I felt it myself last night. I had not really hit a wall, but at 10 o'clock, I was finished with what I was working. I went upstairs to get a meal, and I'm here isolated in my own home. And I felt really low. And how do we make sure that our associates regain that energy in that process? And the final piece is what I started off with. We really do need to do a formal recontracting. I don't think that there's enough focus on the subject of how are we as a team. What we do is we go on an offsite and we create a set of values that we're going to live to, and we put a poster up, and that's supposed to be there forever, or at least until the CEO changes and they create another set of mission, vision, values. But really recontracting how we show up behaviorally on a daily basis against all these things we've just talked about. It's a real important act, and it's probably the very first thing that somebody needs to do when going remote if you're going to upgrade the performance of your team. So those are the areas. And between the two of us, we can dive into any or all of them, given our time, intermittently going through questions that might come in from the audience.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great, Keith, if we can explore some of the strategies that relate to some of those. There is a question that's come through, which I think really does speak to this point about the need to contract or to recontract. And it's about the concern that we often have, or people often have, about remote working, which is that it's, out of sight, out of mind. If I'm not in front of my manager, are they really going to be attuned to me? And will they know what's going on for me? And the question here is is how can this be addressed effectively? And what practical things might you do to manage that dynamic?
Yeah. Well, I do a few things. We're getting into something which is a little hygienic in nature, because I was just on this. One of my clients was one of the largest telecoms in the world. One of their concerns is whether or not, this is an old school concern, by the way. The old school concern is, well, my people are at home. Are they actually working? Right? That's productivity question. And I don't think that is of greatest concern to a younger generation who's pretty used to being fluid and mobile, et cetera, and using all the tools. But I would have a couple of suggestions on that. Number one, we do need to redefine the meeting architecture. There's three big buckets of concern of, is your team ready? Is your organization ready to be remote? And there's three analysis that we do. One, not just do they have the tools, but are you using the tools well? There is nothing worse in an organization than giving everybody tools and then having them go remote, and everybody is inundated texts and emails with their conversations with each other. It ends up playing scavenger hunt. I'm a big advocate of some of the tools like Slack, Microsoft Meetings, and others, where we use those as a way to manage the communications of the team around distinct threads. It's also, and I think this is really important, we don't know if some of our most important employees are going to end up getting sick. And if they get sick and all of the communications are tied up in their email boxes and in their text streams, we can't put somebody else in the middle of the work to be able to foot right in. If we use something like Slack and you're using the right designation of different threads, a new person can come in, they can see the entire history of the conversation, and they can dive right in and start working, right? The other piece, though, is, in addition to the tools, is about the meeting architecture. My team and I now do daily stand-ups. We didn't do that before because we were able to see each other in the offices. Daily stand-ups in terms of what is it that we're committing to today? What didn't we get done yesterday that we need help with, right? And every day, and then how can we help problem solve with each other? We're doing daily sprints, daily sprints. There is no question of performance and accountability. And here's the thing, we now have the time to do that. We used to be commuting, we used to be jumping on planes. I, as a leader, could never do a daily sprint with my key team members. I am more engaged today from an accountability perspective because of that. And I think that's very important for us to look at meeting architecture. And then we've got the stand-ups, not just the stand-ups, but the staff meetings, how are we using those? So both of those two things, and I'll give one other thing, which is kind of crazy. You could literally open up your computer and keep a video for your entire team all day. Now, there's a lot of teams that are afraid that that's going to erode the bandwidth because they're out of bandwidth right now, literally from a IT perspective. But my team and I are about to go to a section. We all have a open window, and I am sitting there right there with all of my team, and I could just raise my hand and go on audio, and we can all just start talking anytime. So we could be sitting around the same table all day if we wanted to be, just using Zoom windows.
Yeah, no, great idea. And there's a question that has come through, Keith, which I'll just dig into a little bit with you. And it's someone's asking for us to talk a little bit more about what we mean by recontracting, because that, that phrase is a little bit formal. And I think particularly as you talk about that, particularly given that a lot of the folks joining this webinar are in the APAC region, where they've actually been dealing with this situation a little bit longer, perhaps, than the rest of the world. How would you approach, so, as you talk about recontracting, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how would you approach that if, let's say, you're maybe 4 or 5 weeks into virtual working, you've hit some road bumps, and you need to reset a little bit with your colleagues. Any thoughts on that?
Recontracting is something, as I said, we often do when we all get together, we do an offsite, and we said, what are the values and what are the behaviors associated with those values? And we talk about them, and then we put them up on a poster. And, we say we are going to be, one of my clients, says it is going to be bold and courageous. Bold and courageous is one of its values. And then when you get in a meeting, everybody is conflict avoidant and passive aggressive. And they've been that way for years. The culture is Southern. They're passive aggressive, and they are conflict avoidant. They're polite, and yet their values say something different. I recommend that in a day and age of today, we need to be very clear whether or not we are standing up and behaving as we say we're going to behave. Let's take a look at, and so I had given 7 areas plus recontracting as areas to follow. I want you to sit with your team and go through each one. Let's start with candor. I want you to sit with your team, and I want the script would be, in this crisis, do we as a team agree or disagree that we are going to speak our minds in meetings? If we're thinking something, we're going to say it. Do we agree or disagree that it is low professional behavior to not speak our mind in the meetings, but talk behind each other's backs? We do it all the time. We talk behind each other's back all the time. So we have that dialogue about what we agree. And then at the end of that conversation, we say, do we agree that it is to our integrity? Do we promise that we are going to speak our minds in meetings and be candid? We're going to be willing to challenge each other. Great. So that becomes an element. Now, we have actually got a survey tool that we use with our clients that measures whether or not we're doing it. And we use that survey tool every 2 to 3 months to test whether we are getting better at candor, whether we're getting better at these behaviors that are critical. So you agree with the behaviors, and you agree what that would look like, and then you test it. And what I had promised you guys I'd do this morning when we talked, and I'll do it, is we will put up on the Resource Center page a sample of that survey that your people can use. And we'll even give you a paragraph of how to begin the dialogue around recontracting. And so you can recontract with your team around these things, just as we would if we were coaching the team.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think, I mean, our the encouragement here to people is, how might you use this situation as an opportunity to maybe address things that haven't been working for a while? Because we're now in this situation where, the normal rules don't apply and we've got a little bit more license to experiment. So like you said, it's something that might otherwise feel artificial. Now you have a script, or you have a reason to go into that dialogue.
And MC, you mentioned that this is in Asia, maybe. I mean, we're now later in the day in most of the country, so we're dealing with Europe and Asia. I feel that there are cultural norms that I know lead us to being more or less deferential to authority. And I'm not suggesting that Asia is more deferential than a old guard American company, because old guard American companies are pretty hierarchical, control oriented, and deferential to authority. So, but then again, it is an earmark of not speaking up against authority in certain countries. So, but it does not serve you. It does not serve the company, and it doesn't serve shareholders. So we need to have a dialogue. There was a great leader, David Novak of Yum Brands, a number of years ago, who wrote a book, Taking People With You. And he really brought a degree of openness, dialogue, communication, and candor to the Asia Pacific region just through a recontracting process of saying, no, these are the norms of what it means to be a high level professional.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, this is an opportunity now to look at some of the norms and some of the ways that we can adjust some of those. Great. Well, coming back to the 8 strategies, Keith, I would love to just maybe delve into the detail of a couple more of those before we get to the kind of questions that are coming through on the chat. And particularly this piece about building accountability to each other. Can you maybe give some more strategies around how would you go about doing that in this situation, and particularly, given some of what we've talked about around, maybe not yet having the right technologies in place or the practices in place to have that regular and constant interaction with one another that you might have in a more typical in-person situation. How do you go about building that accountability?
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll actually marry that with the co-creation and collaboration piece as well, because they go hand in hand. The first point is standing in front of the room and recontracting and getting everybody to agree that our commitment to support each other is in holding each other accountable to be our very best. And that we are each willing to see our peers as accountability buddies, not just isolated peers and accountability only goes to the leader, but we're willing to see each other as accountable partners. So if you and I, MC, were now, we used to be siloed individuals. You were a chief marketing officer, head of content, I was head of sales. And now we're literally going to look at each other and say, wait a second, I'm going to hold her accountable and she's going to hold me accountable. And we're going to cross the finish line together. So there's a couple of things you can do. The first thing you can do is you can begin to unleash a greater degree of exposure to each other's goals to the room as a whole. Too many teams sit in meetings and right now one of my clients was doing that this morning on a virtual call. They were doing report outs of their performance. So each business unit would sit on a call just like this. There were 15 people on the Zoom call, and they were doing report outs. Well, what do you think everybody was doing while each person was reporting out? They were all doing email. And I stopped the call and I said, wait a second, here's what we're going to do. Each person's going to do their report out and everyone's going to listen intently, but we're going to listen with an ear toward giving feedback, advice, and support in some fashion. And when MC was done with her report, we broke the room into small groups of 3. And those small groups of 3 discussed what feedback, what advice, what criticism, what support offer, what they would do to help MC be more successful. right? And then everybody was doing that in small rooms. Then we came back into the big room. It only took 5 minutes. Then we came back into the big room, and each team gave MC directive advice. So what does that mean? Everybody listened to MC's presentation. MC got what I call a double barrel of feedback and input from the whole team. MC, in this case, MC was overblown and overwhelmed by the generosity of that feedback. Some of it was stuff that she didn't even think of because another division was going through something that division volunteered to her. The chief legal counsel had an idea of something she should change in order to make her quarter. I mean, there were crazy stuff coming out of the weed work to give it feedback and accountability. And there was more pressure put on MC to perform in her peer group with that kind of feedback. Now, it was all positioned from the perspective of we're trying to make you successful. We're not trying to catch you doing something wrong. We're not trying to one-up you. This is not on that. Well, we can talk about how to build that basis because that's another part of that's that commitment affinity piece. You got to build that too. But that was such a powerful moment, right? Of using collaborative problem solving real time to shift from the old school sitting around and doing report outs to really engaged as a team, not letting each other fail and holding each other accountable. Does that make sense to you? That's just an example. I've got a bunch of others we'll put up on the resource center.
Yeah, no, I love that example. I think that's fantastic. And it actually, you know, it also touches on the piece about candor, right? Because in that situation, then people get accustomed to sharing feedback, sharing thoughts, and it becomes part of the culture. Because, you know, there's another question that comes through here around how do you really get candor to happen if people are scared to speak up or they're scared to give feedback. But that problem starts to go away if you're building in these routines and these rhythms where it's happening naturally. So yeah,
so
really,
let's
really
go.
like that.
Let's go to candor while we're at it then, right? So candor, if that was one of the questions, I believe that the wisdom of Yoda, you know, that little green fuzzy character, the wisdom of Yoda exists in every team. Everything you'd ever want to know, you know, exists in a team, but it's not heard. It's not extracted. And it's not analyzed successfully. So I think a team, at the beginning of every meeting, I want you to designate 2 or 3 individuals, you know, like a third of the team, maybe 20% of the team. You are the Yodas today. So MC, you're our Yoda. And halfway through the meeting, we're going to stop. And as a leader, you say, I'd like to hear from all the Yodas. What is it that you think's not being said? What contribution do you think is in people's mind, but not courageously enough spoken? What is it that we should be talking about that isn't on the dialogue today, right? So there's all these ways you can triangulate, but now then MC volunteers something. Now what's going to happen is we got to protect these Yodas. We've got to make sure that when they state these things, they are not shut down. The leader doesn't get upset. You've got to protect having extracted that candor. If it doesn't fall right for the leader, if it doesn't fall right to the team, it's all okay. We say thank you. This was one person's opinion. We've got to realize that I think in an old school environment, if you had an opinion, you expected it to be followed as a leader. Today, what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase the inputs, and then the accountable party can still make a decision. So just like in that other situation, when MC got all the advice from the team, MC could say, thank you. Here's what I'm going to do based on that advice. She doesn't have to take everybody's advice. This isn't an opportunity for everybody to tell and direct and lead MC. It's just to get the input out there, right? So these Yoda moments, then what starts happening is Yoda becomes a safe word where somebody says, hey, wait a second, Yoda moment, they can say it anytime. And what we find in companies that we've coached is that years later, they're using Yoda moments. It's become a mark of opportunity to use candor. So, you know, and it's funny, even kids will, some of my clients came home and told the story, and now the kids at the dinner table will use Yoda to call it on their parents. Yoda moment, and saying it, you know, their opportunity to speak out, right? So we all need an opportunity to say, hey, wait a second, I'd like to take a risk. Will you please listen to me? And so that's one of the devices to extract candor.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think of all the people who are now maybe having to, their new co-workers or their family. So maybe that is a good strategy to use in those situations as well. One other area that you touched on, I think it was number 7 in your list, Keith, and it has come up in one of the questions, was around energy. And what are some of the ways that you would suggest people dial up their energy when they're not just dealing with the day job, but also a lot of the other added complexities around this current situation, and perhaps managing some of the vulnerability in their team? So how would you suggest tackling that energy piece?
So I'm going to put energy, just like I did with co-creation. I'm going to put energy with commitment and affinity, because I think both of them go hand in hand to lift the morale, lift the engagement of the team. First of all, I start all meetings with a personal check-in of some sort. It's crucial to understand what's going on in people's souls and heart at times of crisis. And you can do this in 5 minutes. If everybody goes around really quick and just says, and I use a thing called sweet and sour. What's the one thing right now that's sweet? What's one thing right now that's sour? Right now what's sweet is as I heard this from a lot of people, we're getting to spend a lot more time with our children, and in ways that really feel meaningful and purposeful, etc. The sour is, I've got an 89-year-old mother who has asthma, and I'm deeply worried about her. And I couldn't be there for her if she did get sick, because she's across the country. And so I'm so desperately concerned about that. Sweet and sour, boom, 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 next person. And, over time, it won't be that same thing. Every time it'll be something different all the time, but it just stays present for people. The other thing is gratitude. At the end of every meeting, I always ask, what do you thank you all for attending this meeting. Let's very quickly go around. What are you most grateful for? Having been here, spent this meeting with us. What is your gratitude? Totally shifts the perspective of somebody to focus on the gratitude. Celebration. I want you to pick 2 or 3 people every meeting and ask them to come prepared to celebrate somebody on the team that they really appreciate, right? So that all of these little ideas, very distinct practices in a virtual meeting that keep the energy high. I also suggest, relative to the commitment and affinity, that you host weekly bonding meetings. People are lonely and people are frazzled. I highly suggest that the team gets together once a week and spends, you can have a half an hour, 45 minutes, and you throw a question on the table, and different people could even suggest to you different questions. A beautiful question to start with is, what experience of your past do you think makes a big impact on who you are today? People can share childhood experiences, etc. There's so many great questions, and we'll put some of those, we call them intimacy questions. Vulnerability breeds empathy. Empathy builds relationship. And that's the foundation for risk-taking, challenging, all the wonderful things. Our model is basically that the relationship is the underpinning of a high-performing team. High-performing teams are emblematic of accountability and candor, right? Then you use co-development, collaboration. Those are the working processes. There's a little model I'm sort of showing you here. But the whole idea, the foundation of it is that relationship. So that's what keeps the energy up.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's been wonderful, some of the examples we've seen coming in from across the LHH world in the past few weeks of teams still doing virtual, cocktail hour and exactly to your those team bonding. I think there's lots of ways we can still try and maintain that as we move through this situation.
Yes.
And I think as well, there's also a responsibility to look after our own energy levels and consider what are some of the normal routines that might be missing for us. I know for me, I'm normally based in the middle of New York City, and I love getting out and having walking meetings when I'm normally in the office. And I've been trying to do that as I work remotely in Ireland. The weather's not quite as nice as it can be in New York, but getting out there, getting that fresh air, because I know it will have an impact then on, my ability to stay engaged and to bring energy to my team. So I think an important point there. Keith, we are almost out of time. There's a couple of questions that have come through on the chat function that I do want to make sure we get to before we wrap up.
Please.
One of the take about if you're the newest member of a team and you're maybe working with a team who are otherwise much more tenured, and I suppose linked to that would be if this is your first time having to work virtually full stop, and some of this is completely new to you, how would you suggest navigating that?
Well, I think there's two different elements to that. If this is the first time you've ever been a virtual or remote worker, I would highly recommend you find a mentor. And that mentor could actually be a 20-some-year-old young lady who lives across the country but has been working remotely and is very adept to Zoom and Slack and all of these things, right? So I think holding up our hand and say, I don't know how to do this. How are other people doing this? Is very important to understand the tools, etc. The other thing is, if you're a new member of the team, you know, this is why I wrote this book. I mean, leading without authority, the intention is to understand that you don't need positional authority in order to achieve success. You can be a leader independent of that. Here you've just listened to this webinar. You could send this webinar to your boss, and you could said with just a note that says, I wonder if it would be a good idea for us to recontract or use some of these tools now that we've been remote. And then why don't you volunteer to further investigate what it would mean to upgrade the skills of this team to be even higher performing. Now, all of a sudden, as the newest member of the team, perhaps the youngest member of the team, you're actually becoming a leader of the team's transformation. Everybody can be a leader if you have a vision and you can enlist people. And I think this is a beautiful opportunity for anybody who's listening, for you to take this, go back to your teams, and you become the precipitator of the transformation of your own team. You don't have to wait until they report to you.
Yeah, no, I love it. And there's also, there was one question or a clarification point that had come through there around, is developing something like a team charter a good way of recontracting some new behaviors? And I think, you know, again, I think that can be a really nice structure for doing that. So there's another potential opening for you is, you know, hey, for the rest of the team, why don't we do this? You know, we don't have a team charter. I think it would be a good idea. Again, it's an easy way into that conversation.
And MC, I think the point is you're using the fact. So what gives you the right to call an audible and say, hey, we need a team charter? Hey, this is new stuff. We are in a whole new world. We're in a world of being remote. We never were. We're in a world of crisis. We weren't. So raising the hand and saying how we work together is going to be more important than ever. Let's do a team charter. I've got a structured framework here that we can use to start with, but then let your team, you know, co-create this team charter using, look, these elements have been statistically validated over 20 years of research. But look, if you decide to work with your team, you can constitute what works for you.
Yeah, great. Fantastic. Keith, we are almost out of time and you've given us so much of your time already today. So I think we will wrap it up there. For folks who've joined, we will be sharing responses to all of the questions that we've had today. We'll be sharing some of the resources that Keith mentioned. I cannot recommend highly enough his book, Leading Without Authority, if you want to delve into a lot more of what we talked about today. I'm going to end with my gratitude moment, Keith. Certainly, there's lots of sweet and sours at the minute, but for me, one of the real kind of silver linings to this situation is that I'm getting to hang out with folks like you and learn new things and learn new strategies for myself. So a huge thank you from all of us again, and we'll look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Again, that URL was virtualteamswin.com, so join us on there and there will be a lot more resources to follow, and enjoy what's rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.